So now we have an energy panel, and we're going to treat an energy panel a little bit differently from how you've probably experienced them at most conferences. We have throughout the day been seeing extraordinary possibilities for alternative energies, but the truth is that a civilization is largely defined by the energy technologies they use, and as Liz Moyer was saying this morning, our civilization is defined by our use of hydrocarbons. And the truth is that energy technologies take a very, very long time to change. And normally the scale of those energy technologies is truly not appreciated by people who aren't directly in the business. So today, we have asked some people who know this better than anyone else, representatives of the hydrocarbon industry, who are at the moment powering the planet we actually possess. So I'd like to invite our energy panelists to join me on stage. Nazeer Bhore, a senior technology advisor at ExxonMobil, to provide a bit of alternative perspective. John Reilly, the coordinator of research of the Joint Program on the Science and the Policy of Global Change at MIT, and Jose Bravo, the chief scientist at Shell Global Solutions. So please join me on stage. I'd like to go and give a special welcome to our viewers online who are joining us for this conversation. Now, as I've done all morning, rather than reading out your extremely impressive biographies, I'd like each one of you to spend a few minutes saying who you are and providing some intellectual context so the audience can understand where you're coming from. Nazeer.
Good morning. I'm really delighted to be here. My name is Nazeer Bhore. I work in the corporate planning department of ExxonMobil in Dallas, Texas, and I help shape the future of energy. Our role in energy is really to supply affordable, reliable, cleaner energy to the world so that the world economy can grow. At the same time, we can mitigate the impact on the environment. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is John Reilly. I'm here at MIT. My appointment is in the Sloan School. I'm an economist. But my major responsibility here is as co-director of something we call the Joint Program on the Science and Policy of Global Change. The overall objective of the program is to understand the entire Earth, oceans, atmosphere, terrestrial vegetation, and the economy, and how we use energy and how that use of energy affects the environment, particularly focused on climate change. And so as climate change becomes an important issue, what sort of other alternatives might we look toward to provide energy for the planet?
Jose.
Well, I want to thank you for having us here. My name is Jose Bravo. I'm one of the chief scientists at Shell. I'm working at the Projects and Technology Organization, and much like my colleague here, Nazeer, looking after some of the longer-term energy implications and the whole energy conundrum and how it's going to affect our business. I started as an engineer, just conventional stuff. Now I find myself later in my career dealing with the really fundamental concepts, and it's interesting how you go from a really detailed to really broad. And I'd like to share some of that journey with you, and based on the questions we get. So I appreciate that.
So we're going to talk about those fundamental concepts all morning. After the panel discussion, we will have an extended chat with Jose, and we'll take a brief break, but I ask you all to send in your questions, and we'll take them afterwards as long as we can. So let's begin by talking about the civilizational scale of the problem, right? Because I don't think people outside the energy industry really understand just how big our energy needs are. So just sketch how big it is. Perhaps Nazeer.
So let me start by talking about two aspects of energy system. I want to talk a little bit about energy poverty and the role it plays in improving standard of living. And I want to talk a little bit about energy density, okay? Two aspects. You may have heard a lot about the scale of energy. Let me talk about energy poverty today. There are roughly 6.5 billion people today in the world. Approximately 1.5 billion people do not have access to electricity. You add another 2 billion people to it who have sporadic access to electricity, and hence their competitiveness is compromised. Competitiveness of the people, of the economy, and the growth. So what we see is that there's a desire for energy to improve standard of living. There's an unquenching thirst for improving standard of living of billions of people around the world, and especially improving standard of living for their kids. And it starts with access to food, access to shelter, access to clean drinking water, access to clean cooking fuels, and then access to healthcare and education, which generally translates to access to electricity. Approximately 40% of the population of the world, that's 2.5 billion people, today use wood and dung as the cooking fuel. And history has shown us over and over again, as soon as their standard of living improves, the first thing they do is to get cleaner cooking fuels like kerosene, like LPG, like natural gas. And in fact, World Bank statistics are 1.5 million people die from indoor air pollution due to use of wood and dung as the cooking media, with roughly 50% of them being less than 5 years. So at the end of the day, the energy challenge is really a humanitarian challenge coupled with an environmental challenge. And the real issue is, how do we supply the energy to the world which is affordable and reliable, at the same time mitigate its impact on the environment, and get ready for energy transitions for the future?
So, Jose, let's talk about why we like hydrocarbons so much. There's a tendency in my world, the technology world, to regard the move to alternative energies as easy. And I think that does a disservice to the problem. If it were easy, we were doing it already. We like hydrocarbons because they're incredibly energy dense. And it's the best we've got. In fact, it's not that easy to refine them at all, as you know. So why do we like them so much?
Well, we like them so much exactly for what you said. They're the most convenient, energy-dense source we have available. And it's not only hydrocarbons in terms of fossil fuels. I mean, the carbon-hydrogen complex is what drives the whole thing. We've derived our energy use from carbon and hydrogen since the beginning of the use of energy in the human species, all the way from fire to... So it's all about the carbon-hydrogen use as our energy source. Hydrocarbons possess the highest amount of energy in the form of carbon and hydrogen of any other material that we know. And the energy density question that Nazeer referred to is very key, because it's not only the fact that it's dense in itself, it has been fairly easy to access. It's getting more and more difficult, right? Mm-hmm. So that dilutes the energy density of the hydrocarbon. We have to spend more energy to get it out. But in terms of why we like it, it's transportable, it's relatively safe, and it's very energy dense. That's the thing. And the example that Nazeer said about the cooking is a very clear one. They tend to go from when people raise their standard of living into denser and denser fuel sources.
And I suppose we've created an entire civilization, an entire infrastructure that's based upon the use of these fuels. So, John, perhaps you could end this kind of scene-setting discussion by discussing some of the problems with the uses of those hydrocarbons and really sketch for the audience where we are with cleaner alternatives. I don't think people understand how little alternatives are currently contributing to the world energy picture.
Sure. So completely consistent with Nazeer's point, as the world develops, we expect that energy use will increase a lot. 2.5 to 3 times over the next 100 years. That's even with incredible efforts to use energy more efficiently. Just a lot of people don't have energy, and as an economist, we want them to be wealthier, so we don't want to cheat people out of that. We want them to be wealthier, but with that, they'll want these energy services. One of the studies I think of interest that we've done is to say, could we fuel the economy with something else? And so if you really can't use fossil fuels, because we're concerned about climate change, when we do studies of this continuing increase, we have increases in global temperatures of 5 degrees C or more. But one strategy might be biofuels. What would be the scale of that activity if it had to supply all of our liquid fuels? Well, our estimate is about 1 billion hectares of land, so that's as much as all cropland. So you can see the trade-off there is that if we push a lot of cropland out for biofuels, that's having this effect on food, which Nazeer was also pointing out is obviously a critical need for people. So we have these trade-offs. There's also environmental impacts of agriculture at that large scale. We've looked at supplying a big chunk of the world's energy with wind power, and there you're really talking about lining up windmills across the entire Great Plains of the United States, across large areas of Europe and Asia, and we've found then there can be climate impacts of that large-scale wind farms by actually reducing the mixing of the air at the lowest level as the wind power takes the momentum out of the air, and then you get stagnation and heating at the surface. So even those can have scales. Currently, these renewables are supplying maybe, except for the biomass used in traditional manner, only 1 or 2% of the world's energy. So, we think of them, they're beautiful little things, but they have to be a much larger scale if they're going to make a contribution.
But the future potentiality. So here's a figure which the audience probably doesn't know. How much does solar now contribute to world energy? It's tiny, right?
Yes, less than 1%.
Less than 1%. And there are fundamental, physical problems with current solar systems. So I thought we could. So we'll talk at the end about some of the more extraordinary potentiality we have for things like solar. But there are things that we have now, right, that these two folks and John thinks are promising in the short term, which give us a bridge to a cleaner energy future. So perhaps you guys could talk about what your companies are working, what John finds promising. So I know that Exxon likes natural gas.
Yes. I think clearly natural gas is the bridging fuel to the future, as the MIT natural gas study showed. And here is an example where there has been a revolution in natural gas, and yet it's not really known outside. And there's a revolution in the United States. The supply of natural gas has gone through a sea change from the U.S. shale gas changes. Today, we expect, over the last 10 years, in the year 2000, shale gas was less than 1% of the U.S. natural gas production. Today, it's 10%. It's expected to go to 50% by 2035, according to Serum. That's nowhere in the U.S. history has a new energy source come in so silently and made such a large impact. It just reminds us that changes in energy scene are very evolutionary in nature in the short run, but over a long run, they have a revolutionary impact. And we feel natural gas has tremendous advantage because it's tied and it can be an easy fuel for electricity. I talked about the need for electricity. Globally, electricity demand is going to go up by 80% from 2005 to 2030. And given the capital cost and the economics and the greenhouse gas emissions, the economics coupled with OECD countries or the developed countries having greenhouse gas mitigation policies really would drive nuclear, natural gas, and wind into power generation.
How much cleaner can natural gas be than, say, coal energy production?
From a greenhouse gas perspective, natural gas would say 50 to 60% lower greenhouse gas per kilowatt hour produced compared to coal. But it's not just the savings of greenhouse gas, it's also the cost. Because the cost of greenhouse gas avoidance by substituting coal with natural gas is less than $50 per ton. You should compare that with many of the costs that are there in transportation sector, which could go as high as $200, $300, $400 per ton.
So, John, the MIT natural gas study came out fairly dramatically. It made a lot of news. Where here in campus, we basically put a lot of our hopes behind natural gas as the best possibility we have right now.
Well, I mean, again, as Nazeer said, in this study, we said, what if we had to reduce emissions in the U.S., greenhouse gas emissions by 50%? And largely, we were able to do that all through substituting natural gas in the electricity sector, and then the carbon pricing that would result in a considerable improvement in efficiency. So we would have, more efficient vehicles, more efficient homes, but the big energy substitution was natural gas. I think, there has been this unwillingness to move forward on climate policy because, people say that, well, we need revolutionary new technologies. And so until we have them, people didn't want to make a step forward. But I think the important aspect of this study is for about 40 or 50 years, we have very well-known technologies. We don't have to do anything to kind of use natural gas and electric power. We know how to do that. That doesn't mean we don't want to continue some of these advances in technology, because ultimately we will need them. We will need carbon capture and storage. We will need nuclear. We will need further advances in battery technology or vehicles that really can run, without any fossil fuel and without any CO2 emissions. But we can do a lot, just with the technology we have. And so that, I think, is the important message. And gas was an important part of it because of this shale gas resource.
Mm-hmm. Shell is extremely interested in biofuels, isn't it? So,
we are, yeah.
But you have a particular approach. So perhaps you could chat about what biofuels will work and what biofuels won't work.
Well, there's, I think everybody in the audience would recognize that biofuels have suffered from a tremendous amount of good and bad press and a lot of myth and reality conflicts and so on. But in the end, biofuels are not new. I mean, we've used biofuels for the longest time, right? And actually, they were the first source of fuel we ever had. So, but the utilization of biofuels in an industrial scale and in the scale of the civilization support that we need is something that we see as one of the elements that is fundamental into the whole sustainability issue. Now, what makes a sustainable biofuel is a really interesting question, and it's a very particular question. What is sustainable in Brazil with sugarcane may not be sustainable with another crop in another part of the world. So it gets very regionalized. So we have taken an approach where, Shell provides a lot of biofuels to its customers. We provide a lot of first-generation biofuels in partnership with others. So we basically sell the biofuels in blends. Mm-hmm. But we are developing technologies through joint ventures and internally in two particular areas which are very key. One is cellulosic ethanol, and the other one is the possibility of biologically derived oils from algae and things like that. Exxon will probably tell you a lot more about that as well. But those two seem to be the focus of what we see into the future. Now, the issue is scale. That is and it comes from energy density. I was born in Mexico City, a city of 20-odd million people. If you were to build a facility that took algae and extracted oil to make diesel in a quantity that, for those of you in the oil industry would recognize, let's say 50 to 100,000 barrels a day, a moderate amount, not really a staggering amount. The amount of water you need to process to do that is the same amount of water that the city of Mexico City treats. Okay, so this is what you're talking about, providing energy at the cost of a lot of the use of other resources. Mm-hmm. That's the focus of our interest in Shell, is how can you actually do that without having that tremendous impact of on land crop or water usage and other resources. So it's a massive problem. It's going to take a long time, and that's one of the things that biofuels arena has suffered from, is an excess of optimism in that the fact that this is going to be here really soon. I mean, they put a little bit of diesel or a little bit of jet fuel into a Continental Airlines jet, and then suddenly we have biojet, and yes, it's one instance. The scale issue is the one that needs to be solved more than the technology issue.
You talk to the professionals, that's what you always hear, isn't it, John? They talk about the problems of scale, that it can be done in a lab and done well in a lab like Amyris or LS9 doesn't mean that you can actually significantly contribute to the world's fuel needs.
Yeah, I mean, you get at these issues of just how much water, how much land, how much do you need. It's easy to be, it's easy to be very pessimistic as you look at these sorts of things, because every solution you look at, people talk about, is there a silver bullet? As soon as you look at each silver bullet, it looks a little tarnished and it's not moving as fast as a bullet. So I try to give myself an avoidance of being totally pessimistic. We have to rely on, the technologists to kind of improve these things and find the solutions. But there will be these trade-offs that we're going to make as we go forward.
So can we bend the demand curve? We haven't talked about efficiency yet at all. So the United States tends to use about twice as much energy as Japan and Europe. If we bended the demand curve, would it have a significant impact upon our energy needs, or population growth and the legitimate demands of the poor and developing world for more cheap energy mean that at no point in the next 100 years, do we use less energy?
I think it's very unlikely that we can kind of supply the needs of poor growing populations with less energy. We may be able to keep it flat in the world or have it grow by 50%. But there's going to be costs to that. I think but there are ways to do it. We can be a lot more efficient, and some pricing signals would do that. Mm-hmm. But it's hard to see us kind of actually reducing energy use. And some of the sorts of energy. What we mean by energy use is a little bit tricky because if you have a very efficient source like natural gas, the primary energy equivalent of using it directly is relatively low. If you have to kind of produce electricity, you lose half of it in the conversion, or you lose low-grade energy sources, you're losing a lot in conversion. So there's a real issue of what we mean by accounting. If we move to something like biomass, there's a big conversion loss, so the kind of primary energy is actually quite large. So that's one of the issues. Sometimes we get more efficient on the end use, but if we're using a very efficient form, then it may have broader implications system-wide for primary energy.
Jose.
If I may, I'd like to add something. I think that's right on point. The population growth and the search for better standard of living is going to make it very difficult to actually bend the demand curve into going down. But I think that we have a responsibility to continue to try to find ways to control that, because it's like anything. I mean, you expect the growth, but you don't want inflationary growth in it. You want it to do it in a more responsible way. So the efficiency issue is key. In its efficiency at the industrial level as well as at the personal level that you need to address. But you have to be careful not to fall in the trap of false efficiencies, mm-hmm. because you can gain efficiency in an engine, and as you said very well, if the distribution system needs to be less efficient to provide you that efficiency, you haven't gained. So the end-to-end analysis, the life cycle analysis of a solution is something that we've learned to do now. We didn't do very well in the past, and that's where the answers will lie. But we should not take our foot off the brake of efficiency. We got to continue to look at that.
So, Nazeer, is the most we can hope for to bend the demand curve a little bit to go and keep it flatter?
So let me make a few observations on efficiency. I would say in the next 20 years. I'm not going to talk 100 years first. In the next 20 years or 25 years, what we see is that the energy demand is going to go up by 35%. The curve will not bend completely. But underlying it are some interesting trends. Okay? The energy demand will go up 35% with significant efficiency improvement, but if the efficiency improvement had not occurred, the energy demand would have gone up by 95%. So in some ways, the energy services is tackled 2/3 by demand management and 1/3 by supply management. And then within that supply, the trends are very different for developed versus developing countries. In the developed countries, US, Canada, Mexico, or OECD countries, the energy demand for the next 25 years is going to be flat. The greenhouse gas emissions is actually going to turn over and go down. But the increase will essentially all be in the developing countries because the standard of living is own. And we have to also recognize that their per capita energy consumption and per capita greenhouse gas emissions, even in 2030, 35, would be a fraction of what's there in OECD countries.
So I'd like to talk a little bit now about some of the notionally carbon neutral alternatives, which of course is what we're all excited about. The promised land after that bridge that natural gas offers. So perhaps we could begin with wind and solar and discuss some of the problems with each one of those, and then we'll end with nuclear, which has been in the press a great deal recently. So Any of you who are, so let's begin with wind. So there's a lot of wind energy moving around the planet, and yet there are real difficulties in terms of harnessing that wind.
As you know, Shell has a significant role in wind, particularly in the U.S., and it's been a very interesting business for us. It has a lot of similarities in the prospecting for hydrocarbon resources, because it has a land issue and it has a series of units that you put in this case wind turbines as opposed to wells. So there's a lot of engineering aspects to it that make it a familiar thing for us, and it's been a successful thing. But again, it's when you start to apply it in scale, you start to see some of the limitations it has. You have limitations on materials, some of the very sophisticated materials for the turbines. You have limitations on the environmental impact, not only what it could do to the wind, but people start to object to noise or to the unsightliness of turbines and so on and so forth. So it's always so it does go that. Now, the one thing that wind does have as a serious limitation is the intermittent nature of it. And not only is intermittent at low wind, by the way, it's intermittent at high wind too, because you cannot spin those things too fast. And it lacks the whole wind infrastructure lacks the flywheel that you could have with natural gas or other continuous source of electricity generation. That integration, I think, is something where there's a lot of efficiencies and a lot of good things to be gained that we are just starting to explore now.
So I mean, wind among some of the renewables is as close to being economic as anything, although you see a lot of it now, but there's a lot of subsidization. So there's a lot of tax credits and other sorts of things for wind. So if you actually took those away, it's not clear it would compete. As was just mentioned, the biggest issue is then if you just could build a windmill, that would be great. But we're used to dispatching power to meet load. When you get to wind, you're thinking of dispatching load to meet the power. So it's a big load management issue at one end, if not a storage issue at the other end. And so, I mean, the studies of wind in the United States, wind power maxes in the spring and in the fall. Electricity demand maxes in the summer. We worry about, you get these phenomena that my colleagues in the science say, blocking highs when there's virtually no air stagnation over the whole eastern part of the United States. That's when you have the deathly hot summers. If you're relying on wind, all of a sudden you don't have electricity. So you need this backup capacity. So that is, I think, the biggest issue with wind at this point is matching load and demand. People talk about smart grids maybe doing that, but in the end, it's hard to shift all the load from the summer to the spring. So there's variability on all time scales, on seasonal, on daily, and on the second scale, all which have to be dealt with.
So Nazeer, we'll talk about intermittent power sources and storage in a second, but let's focus on solar in particular. So the problem with solar at the moment is we can make extremely efficient but very expensive solar cells, right? And we can make really cheap but not very efficient solar cells. So what are the technical challenges to making solar a real contributing energy source?
I mean, I look at it as very simple, which is you've got multiple ways to supply electricity. And at the end of the day, it's the cost and the carbon footprint. And those are the two main variables that affect it. For a broad-based market, there are lots of niche markets where things can come in. I mean, I recall that as a teenager, I could buy a solar calculator. Right. And in that niche market, solar stands on its own feet for more than 2 decades or 3 decades. So here we are not talking about the niche markets, and solar will continue to climb the curve on the niche market scale. But can it be used broadly, for example, at home? And our view so far is that, based on information we have, is between wind, solar, and geothermal, if you put that also in the mix of the low-carbon source, we like wind better than solar and geothermal, because we just don't see how its cost will come down so fast to compete with a good wind site.
So, but all these sources, and this is a question for all of you, have something in common. All intermittent sources basically they put all sorts of disincentives upon energy suppliers because there's actually no way to go and guarantee peak load capacity. So here at MIT, there's a lot of work going on to go and fix that by creating some kind of storage technology around intermittent. So perhaps we could talk about where we are with fixing the problems with intermittent sources. Any of you?
Yeah. I think storage technology is the holy grail, and there have been significant improvements in storage technology. But once again, the storage technology comes in the higher value segments first. So when let's take the example of lithium-ion batteries. Lithium-ion batteries first came in cell phones, in laptops, in handheld devices, and they're likely going to come first in hybrids for mass markets before they come in for plug-in hybrids and EVs. And it's a fascinating example because most of you may not be aware that lithium-ion batteries were first developed and discovered at the Exxon Strategic Research Lab in New Jersey in the 70s. And we were looking for applications in watches and so on. And the technology was not ready. It took multiple innovations in cathode, anode, separator films, and also in the electrolyte. And all of them combined really got this technology ready in the 90s, and that's when Sony, together with the separator films from ExxonMobil, put the first consumer device. So all I'm saying is that at least for transportation, which is where lithium-ion batteries come because of their low weight and high energy density, it needs a significant amount of improvement before it can be competitive with gasoline, but that doesn't mean that it cannot come in early use segments like hybrids.
But Jose, we can't do storage at all at a grid scale at the moment. I mean, the audience may not know this, but honest to God, the grid solutions for storage at the moment are pumping water up hills. Yeah. I mean, it's barbarically pre-industrial, essentially.
Well, so, you also capture rain and hold it in dams.
Well, right. So, yeah. And there's interesting work going on at places like MIT with large grid-scale batteries, but take the audience through some of the problems with storing power from intermittent sources.
All right. So your first question to me was around why do we like hydrocarbons?
Yeah, that's right.
And it just dawned on me that one of the things that we like hydrocarbons for is because they have solved the storage issue.
They store energy in themselves.
I mean, the biomass that led to hydrocarbons, that led to us using them, that was the solution of a storage issue. So, I agree that there is a great deal of potential in storage, and it's not the conventional storage only that we were talking about, but batteries where you store electricity. But I think there's ways, and I cannot tell you what they are, but conceptually, the capture of all the energy that's around us and the management of it through storage and deployment, I think is a fascinating opportunity for something in the future. Not only, like I say, for electricity, but it can be for other types of energy sources. We always struggle with the storage question, but we tend to focus our efforts a lot on technology to extract new sources or products or efficiency. But this whole connectivity of storage, infrastructure, and deployment is an area that is in great need of continuous innovation. And I'm sorry, I don't know what that would be, but it is something that's wide open that we should look at.
Well, John, you're familiar with Don Sodaway's work here you're familiar with Don Sodaway's work here on campus with these large grid-scale storage devices. Could you talk about how likely that is or when it's going to appear?
I mean, I find it's just hard to imagine that we're going to have large grid-scale battery storage. I mean, particularly as you have to go, with renewables where we have these seasonal issues. Batteries, as I said before, there's many different time frames of storage that we need. The battery technology and electricity storage seems to be something that could really be effective and is being used, on the seconds to minutes to maybe an hour scale, where if the sun is highest at noon, but the peak electricity demand occurs at 3 o'clock, maybe you can do something with that. So in that evening out this sort of thing there, it's big. It's big. I think as barbaric as pumped hydro sounds or compressed air storage, some of those seem more feasible over longer periods of time. And ultimately, people wonder whether we can produce, hydrogen with electricity in downtime, and then that becomes energy carrier. Again, an expensive process, but then you have this energy carrier going that way. So, there are many storage issues along the line. I just can't imagine the size of the batteries you'd need to kind of really do grid scale on these long-term. People imagine that, if we had an electric vehicle fleet, that it could be a distributed storage mechanism. Yeah. There you have to kind of coordinate the idea of, people plugging in their vehicles at the right time, or whether they want, and I think one of the issues there is, can you have batteries that have rapid recharge and discharge, and does that compromise the lifetime of the battery? So so that's people are thinking very creatively about this, and if you have all these batteries around and could use them to balance the system, wouldn't that be fascinating? But you can think of the coordination issues that would be involved in that.
So nuclear energy could solve a lot of these problems, right? And there's been a extraordinary renewal of interest in nuclear energy. As we speak, I believe the Chinese are building some 35 power plants. I believe a new power plant for the first time in 30 years is being constructed here in the United States. But there are serious policy problems in terms of the cost of the construction of these new plants. So perhaps we could discuss the future of nuclear in this country and abroad. John?
Well, the thing with nuclear is we have experience. We have 100 power plants, so we know we can do it. Obviously, we know we have, or at least when poorly managed, the Chernobyl thing, we've had big problems. The U.S. 3 Mile Island thing is actually somewhat more of a success story in that there was no significant radiation release, but we do have, those sorts of issues. People think there are, safe power plant technologies, ones that, fundamentally would not melt down, they would go out, so that sort of technologies exist. The experience with building the plants now is that one was built in Finland, it's gone way over budget, so people come up with estimates, and then the costs, and when they try to do it, just escalate. So the idea is if we got back in the swing of building these things, we're building a lot of them, could we regularize the production, bring the cost down? But frankly, one of the biggest, there are continuing siting issues, but I think the biggest issue at this point is just the cost. The cost is probably double that of a pulverized coal plant. So absent a real incentive to do something, people are going to coal or gas.
Would that incentive have to come from the government reasonably to go? Would that have to be a government-based incentive at this point?
Well, being an economist and our interest in climate change, we would look at a broad-based, cap and trade system on carbon emissions, which would send a price through the economy. And if nuclear is the cheapest way to address that, we would address it. But if natural gas can do it for 20 or 30 years, then that would happen. So we'd like to see that happen that way and just let the market pick the best solution. There may be, there's been some effort in the United States to kind of streamline the regulatory process in nuclear. So to the extent there's regulatory issues in some of these sources, then you need some government, clarification of those things. The same issue with carbon capture and storage, who's responsible for carbon if it leaks and other sorts of things. So there is some regulatory things that have to go on in the back, but we'd like to see a nice level playing field with everything reflecting its full social cost.
So I'm going to take some questions from the audience shortly, but before I do, I want to ask a question about regulation, about government policy, and then I want to end before I take questions from you guys on what is today the most heated conversation in the energy sphere, which is whether we need the miracles which technologists are working on, or whether we should move incrementally and an evolutionary process. So let's talk about policy. So there are essentially three possibilities, right? You could have a cap and trade of some sort. You could have a Pigovian tax. Pigovian taxes are named after a British economist, Pigou, who suggests that if you place a clear and transparent price upon a socially undesirable activity like smoking, you can create an incentive to move. Or you could have a straight regulatory framework by which you would say in 2020 you have to retire the following plants that emit the following amounts of carbon. So I know you all have very different views of this. So what do you guys think will be the best possible policy prescription for changing the incentive structure for how we currently consume energy? Nazeer.
I would say first we need to recognize that greenhouse gas emissions are going to go up in the next 20 years.
No matter what? No matter what?
No matter what, because of non-OECD countries. And that when we look at all the options, we need to look at its effectiveness, its scale, its cost. And there are a few criteria that we use to kind of compare these options. And the criteria is whether the option that we use ensures a clear and transparent and a predictable cost of carbon that's economy-wide. Not across subsectors of the economy, but economy-wide. Whether it's transparent to the consumers as well as companies. Whether it allows marketplace and open competition to select the solutions. And whether it can be used to add more countries as countries develop. And whether it can adjust to the evolving climate science as well as the impact on the economy due to climate policies. And when we look at all these options, our view is that a carbon emissions or a carbon tax or an emissions tax, like a Pigovian tax, is the preferred option, primarily because it's transparent, it does not require a large carbon securities, and you know what happens with securities, and that it can be handled within the framework of our current tax system to make it revenue neutral. And having a carbon tax also helps us with adding different countries if they want to add at a later stage. So when we look at all that, we prefer carbon tax. Of course, the devil of all of this is in the detail, but I would say the key perspective is to have an economy-wide, predictable carbon price so that there is stability. A lot of the things that can be done today are not being done because of uncertainty and lack of stability in policy.
John.
I mentioned the cap and trade system before. Actually, there's been a lot of political support behind a cap and trade system, largely from the environmental community, although I think it's become you had some, when we were discussing this session, I remember you had some, what did you say about a cap and trade system?
It was so rude, I don't think it bears repeating. But cap and trade systems they're complex. They're not clear, they're not transparent. No one much likes them. There's support for them because it's the best we can do, it sometimes seems.
So what I would say is, we had the successful cap and trade system on sulfur emissions, and so that was part of the reason people became attractive. I think when people expanded it to the outside the electricity sector, economy-wide, in the carbon thing, and then deal with it internationally, it becomes some of the more complex issues arise. I actually somewhat am on Nazeer's side of a tax is pretty straightforward, and from an economic standpoint, either one of those could operate more or less the same, and the one advantage of the tax is it does provide a very clear and consistent signal, and it doesn't create this variability, and so people can plan relatively straightforwardly with it. The big issue I think that environmentalists are concerned about is whether the country would commit to a tax that actually would be big enough to make a difference. They like the idea of a certain carbon cap because then they know we're going to achieve that. But I think the idea of trying to pass something that's going to be effective, but the price isn't transparent, may not be politically sustainable, because once people see that it's going to have a high cost, they may become disillusioned with it. So if you put a tax out on the table, at least people know what they're passing.
John, how high would the tax have to be to actually change economic behavior? So if it was high enough to hurt, it would be high enough to hurt.
Yeah. So there's an equivalency between, when we do our modeling, there's an equivalency between a cap and trade is a quantity thing and a price target. So when we do that, we start out with a Waxman-Markey type of legislation at around $20 a ton of carbon. That isn't enough to massively change transportation, but if you're a coal producer and a coal utility, that has a massive effect. So it begins to hit you there, and you start shifting to natural gas. It has to continue to rise. So we would have it rising up to $200, $250 a ton by 2050, and then you start having some impact on transportation. A lot of people look at these cap and trade systems or these prices and say, well, it's not really big enough to have any big effect because it's not going to make their favorite high-cost technology effective. But the beauty of them is that maybe you don't have to use that high-cost technology. You can switch from coal to gas, or have some efficiency improvement. So, people get confused about that. They say, oh, well, the tax has to be this because I think solar has to come in, but maybe solar isn't the most economic solution, and so it's not going to come in. So a lot of the politics around this are the people that come together over carbon policy have some alternative technology, and they'd like to see it come in, and when they see an inefficient incentive to make their thing happen, then they're unhappy with that policy. But that's one of the things we grapple with in the politics of the whole situation, I think.
Jose, what is Shell like? Or what do you like, if you don't want to speak for Shell directly?
We like whatever allows us to make decisions, okay? And that's, I think, the key. A price or a tax or whatever framework is there for us to make decisions on what we do and do not do. Or right now, the decisions are made on the basis of speculation, fear, science, or politics. Or it's a very difficult environment to deal with it, and a lot of people just kind of retrench and sit back and do nothing because it's so confusing. So what Shell would really like to see is whatever framework comes to play that is fair and that is free market based, but that allows us to make business decisions. One of the difficulties is that I think to create that framework where you talk about a tax or a cap and trade or any other thing, there's got to be some accommodation for the different situations regionally, because it's not. You would not approach the problem from an economic point of view the same in the U.S. as you would in China, okay? And because of this standard of living and population growth and so on, there has to be some accommodation for that. So it also needs that respect for whatever the development curve countries are in.
But what's unacceptable to everyone on the panel is the lack of predictability.
Correct.
The lack of transparency. What's amazing to me of this whole debate is that this is something that the entire energy community is fairly consistent on, whether they're economists or they are energy producers, and yet we continue to circle around cap and trade or other less transparent solutions. It's one of those things where there actually is consensus, and we can't somehow move the debate forward. So on that note, I want to return to something that Liz and I were talking about this morning, which I know the energy community is divided about. So I was talking about a call by Bill Gates and the AEIC, and I remembered what it stands for. It's the American Energy Innovation Council. They said that we must significantly increase the amount of R&D that is taking place in this country and abroad. They want to increase it from 11 billion in this country to 16 billion. They would do so by a straight 2% tax upon carbon. And then they would phase out more polluting power plants over the next 50 years through a regulatory framework. And the reason behind this is as follows. The AEIC says that at no point on this planet do we use less energy, as the panels disagreed with, and we don't have any existing technology that can save the planet. So the AEIC says we have to go and embrace what they call miracle breakthroughs. And this was much talked about over the last year after Bill Gates threw his weight behind it and said he might start funding technologies like the TerraPower 5th generation nuclear reactor. And I've never talked to anyone inside the energy industry who isn't mildly annoyed by this proposal. So why is the hope for miracle breakthroughs the wrong way to think about it? Any of you? Jose?
I think to me personally, it's the word miracle thing.
Because miracles don't exist.
Yeah. It's like you're throwing. I don't think that the solution. You don't create a miracle by throwing money at something. That's never been the case. Okay, and this we don't know what we don't know. So this is going to have to happen as part of the activity that we all engage in. So increased funding for research. I mean, I'm a researcher. That always sounds good, right? Mm-hmm. And the source of it, well, of course, if the government is going to pay for it, well, then that's even better, right?
Yeah.
But in the end, it is not about the amount of money that you throw into it. It's about the understanding first that there's not going to be one morning we're going to wake up and Bill Gates would have funded the project that saved the Earth. It's not going to happen like that. Somebody was asking me outside, what is the next change? How is this going to change? And my feeling is that you won't know. It already would have happened by the time you say the change happened. And I think that's what is difficult about these. Let's put money in there and let's come up with a miracle. And I don't think that's going to happen like that.
Nazeer, what's wrong with hoping for miracle breakthroughs?
First of all, I want to say that government money does not come in free. It comes from all of us. Okay, so we have to first remember that. Let me talk about AEIC. We agree with AEIC with the conclusion that it's better to spend money on R&D than to subsidize implementation of currently uneconomic choices. And the example he states in that is the feed-in tariffs in Europe. But most of the other part of it, we flat out disagree. Let me explain why. I think government has a role in R&D, but it's pre-competitive R&D and getting the education and research and science environment out. Government is best that the competitive R&D is left to the free marketplace. It is best that demonstration of competitive R&D be left to the free enterprise. The whole conclusion of AEIC is based on SEC R&D statistics. And you will see this graph repeated everywhere, which shows that energy companies spend much less in R&D than, let's say, auto companies. But the SEC R&D company statistics are completely flawed. Let me give you 2 examples. And PFC Energy, a consulting company, has done some studies on it. And the bottom line conclusion is that if energy companies used an R&D definition like auto companies use, they would have to include the entire exploration budget in R&D, which would increase their R&D by somewhere between 200 to 400%. Second example, the single largest energy source that has occurred in the US in the last 10 years, which is going to revolutionize energy industry here and in the world, is shale gas. We talked about it today. Which were the companies that contributed to that change? That change was really understanding how to cost-effectively drill, make horizontal wells, and then do hydraulic fracturing to stimulation. The companies that made that technology feasible were XTO, the company that ExxonMobil bought recently, Devon Energy, Chesapeake, and EOG. These 4 companies don't even publish how much money they spend in R&D in their SEC filings. So the statistic that's used to make that argument is so flawed that it did not even capture the single largest energy revolution that has occurred in the last 10 years. So I think there are lots of flaws. This is one of them. I think energy innovation, we are proud of the innovation we have been doing. I cannot speak for other companies and other energy industry, but we are proud of what we have done over the last 100, 150 years. We have a strong pipeline of technology, and free market has a way to figure out. None of us, no head of a company, and no head of a government can predict how technology would evolve in the future and what time frame it will evolve and who is going to be the winners and losers. This is best decided by the marketplace, not by a national energy board as indicated by AEIC.
So I want to take questions from the audience now, but before I do, I've been submitted a question over our webcast, which is somewhat intemperate, and it asks, were a miracle to emerge, would you guys actually embrace it? Yeah. Sure.
I mean, absolutely. We work for our shareholders. I mean, an example of that is the XTO. I mean, the unconventional gas. Yeah. Who would have thought 5-10 years ago we would have a large R&D on algae? Mm-hmm. Sure, we'll embrace it.
Absolutely, we would embrace it. But we wouldn't pin our hopes on miracles. That I think is the difference. We hope that we can find solutions, but that doesn't have to be miraculous.
Well, one way to think about it is maybe not to say so much the miracles never occur, but we do have energy miracles, but they take 50 to 100 years to work through. Let's take questions for as long as we can, please. In the front, on the left.
You talked about the miracle approach, the incremental approach,
I'm sorry, 1 second. The mic isn't working. Okay. Yes, now, I think. Why don't we try this mic if we can? There we go.
This one is working. Yeah. You want to come here or go ahead?
You go ahead, please.
Good morning. Paolo Legato, Italy. Just would like to pose to your attention one hypothesis came from the Russian scientist Vladimir Kucherov, now working at the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, saying that gas and oil in general maybe doesn't have a biotic origin, but just a geological one. And so his intervention we had a chance to listen to in Torino in July during a conference was that we probably shouldn't address our efforts in finding new sources of energy, but just finding new ways to use this carbon or in general greenhouse gases effects and to store them or to use them in a better way. So this may be provocative maybe, but I'd like to know your comments about this. Thank you.
Whatever the origin of oil and gas, there's a lot of carbonaceous stuff out there. So we have shale oil, we have oil sands, we have the shale gas. So there's lots of it out there. We have the methane hydrates. So there's just many thousands of years of possible things out there. The issue is dealing with using it without emitting CO2 in the atmosphere. And so if we can crack that nut, then okay, I think there is an issue of how much of that stuff do we want to pump into the ground and store. So I think that's the issue there.
Please.
Okay, thank you. Tom Cadella, Research Pays. You were speaking about the miracle approach versus incremental approach. I want to add a third one, which would be the socialism approach. And this is an idea that came up from an MIT professor who couldn't be here today, so I'm going to share this with you, which I think is kind of interesting. But in terms of policy, it would be that we would tax the use of carbon in this country, and then that money, because this is the real key, is where does the money go? Does it go back to R&D? Does it go to the government? Where will it be wasted or used more efficiently, almost like the energy itself? And the idea we came up with was to actually have a disbursement that would go back in an equal fashion to all American citizens. So if you think of it, the person who uses the most energy is going to pay the most tax, will receive the lesser rebate, and the person who uses the least amount will still receive the same rebate. And that has a socialistic aspect to it, which actually would fuel the economy, which again leads to, we're thinking of all this energy, how are people going to be able to pay for it, out of their earnings and so forth. But just some comments on that, please.
So we've done such a study and looked at what the impact would be based on the allocation. And so, in fact, that does have the effect of exactly as you said. The costs are then borne by the wealthiest 20 or 30% of the country, and poor consumers are fully compensated for any increase in cost they have. So it's an equity issue. I guess the term socialist is such a third rail in the U.S. I'm not sure. I'm not sure you're making it more likely to happen by calling it that. But it does address this issue of concern that if we just put an energy tax on, that would tend to hit the poor people more disproportionately because they spend a larger proportion of their income on energy, and so that sort of rebate system would solve that. And then for those folks that are concerned that the federal government can't spend money efficiently, that takes it out of their hand. So then they don't, waste the money in silly projects. So. I'm just curious what a private sector individual
I agree with John. It's really a way of how do you distribute it back. The piece is that if you tax just carbon, it disproportionately hits the poor people a lot more because it's a larger fraction of their earnings. So, as a society, we need to be, whether you call it socialism or other is a separate issue, but we just need to be aware that we want to make sure that it is fair and balanced. Okay.
Sorry.
No, I was just going to say I agree. It's an issue of equity. What equality, equity? How do you make the best use of it? But there's something appealing to me, at least, the fact that if you tax something, you could use the revenues from that to actually improve that particular situation. as opposed to diluted into the rest of. So some connection between the actual energy issue and the taxes on energy would be, in my opinion, a very, whether you make it equitable for the whole population, but tie it to the energy problem.
We have time for a few more questions. I think you were before this gentleman.
Hi. Brian Collins at Florida Virtual School. So we found the miracle fuel source out there, if you will. But there seems like there'd be huge, tremendous challenges in the infrastructure that would be needed to get it to consumers. And I'm just kind of curious how y'all would get your arms around that. It seems like, electric cars are a good start. They're starting to come out now, but will a lot of people be able to take advantage of them if they can't find a charging station, to get simple electricity?
I think you really have to look at the alternatives from a life cycle analysis perspective. Like in an electric car, at least you have chargers at home. If you have a garage, you can charge them. And with hydrogen, you've got the issue about not just, you don't have the analog of a charger at home because you have to spend money to get hydrogen to a fuel cell car. So you really have to look at life cycle analysis. And one way to look at it is to say, what is the cost of meeting that objective on a social basis? So if your objective is greenhouse gas emissions reduction, then you have to stack up all the options in $1 per ton of greenhouse gas avoided. And you will find that conventional vehicle improvement, better engines, better tires, more aerodynamic cars, light-weighting cars, far outstrip many of the other options that people are talking about. So I would just say that if you have a technology choice which you feel is not coming in because of infrastructure, it is likely there are other cheaper options there, or it's likely that society hasn't sent that market signal in a steady way to the consumers and to the companies that are producing that fuel or the vehicle.
I'd just quickly say, a silver bullet that doesn't have a mode of delivery is not a silver bullet. So you have to kind of think through that element as well. I mean, there are companies that have strategies for getting plug-in electric vehicles on the road with relatively smaller batteries that could or could not be plugged in. So they're still quite efficient in the absence of plug-in, and as the plug-in system develops, then you could plug them in. So I think you have to kind of think of the deployment strategy as well as the fundamental thing, because, that's the thinking now in energy. It is the whole system. You have to have the whole system work from one end to the other in life cycle sort of.
I have a hard time constraint, so we have time for one more question.
Actually,
sorry, forgive me.
I just have maybe a little bit of dilemma about the framing of the debate between needing a miracle and an incremental approach. There's a lot of there's many countries that are actually achieving high wind penetration scenarios up to 17% and higher, particularly in Europe. And you're also seeing states like California moving towards these very aggressive wind penetration scenarios. So I think the technology is actually in place, and one of the technology factors that seems to be enhancing this is wind forecasting and being able to predict accurately what's going to happen. I believe there was a period of 24 hours, or roughly about that time frame, in Spain where they were up to 50% wind penetration. So I'd like to maybe hear a little bit more comment on that.
So we've worked with a Spanish expert who's in charge of running that system. It's not without problems. So many of the issues we talked about, having the windmills producing a lot of power but not being able to be used, exists there. They're having a problem with, then they have to shut down a lot of the other capacity. So yes, they're doing it. What the full cost of that system is unclear. One of the things, if you were prepared to subsidize a lot of windmills into production and you have the rest of the infrastructure there, then you have unlimited backup capacity. So if you have to go into a full equilibrium system where you have to not only build a windmill but replace the backup system, it's another problem. So are there improvements? Can you do better with forecasting? Yes. But unless you can shift the load around, you can forecast all you want, and it isn't going to solve the problem that you're producing electricity when you don't need it.
If I could just respond briefly to that. There's a lot of other evidence now about aggregated effects of wind power that when there's wind actually blowing in multiple geographically dispersed regions, that actually cancels out.
Yeah, except that,
effect.
as I mentioned in my earlier comments, there is this phenomenon of blocking highs when there's virtually no wind in the whole area. We've looked at the analysis, so you can get even these windy areas in the Northwest. There are days when, if you think you have whatever the capacity is, there are days when you're only, if you lump all the things together, getting less than 5% of the capacity. So inevitably, you're going to deal with this.
Yeah, I just...
So, I mean, there's lots of these solutions that are possible, but...
This debate can and will go on after a short break at technologyreview.com/webcast. So if you have burning questions for Jose, please join us by staying in the audience or joining us online. But on that note, I would like to thank our panelists and send you all off to lunch. Thank you, Nazeer. Thank you, John. Jose can stick around. So thank you, guys. For those of you who are not going to stick around for the webcast, I have two options for lunch for you. Me, for sure, is sponsoring a lunch where CT